Are you a lazy lit student hours away from flunking an exam? Do you have a date with someone whose profile says they left to curl up with a good book? Is your hoity-toity book club about to kick you out because they're tired of you telling them life got in the way of Middlemarch? Relax, and welcome to Pretend You've Read It, an audio series designed to make the ill-bred seem well-read. For our first edition, we're going to talk about a book that's always being talked about, Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. Now, some might say Pride and Prejudice is mainly about a bunch of people going to other people's houses to dance and eat. But it's more than that. It's one of the earliest rom-coms. In fact, it's the rom-com from which so many other rom-coms have borrowed their premise from. Girl meets guy, it's hate at first sight, and then they fall in love. The novel is focused on the Bennet family, who are quite a mixed crowd. They're also a big crowd. There's a Mr. Bennet, a Mrs. Bennet, and a handful of Miss Bennets. Here's a short description of each Bennet before we plunge into the story of what happens to them. Mr. Bennet. Solid all-round guy who doesn't put up with fools but ended up marrying one. Just wants to be left alone to drink claret and read in his library. Mrs. Bennet. Total fool. Also noisy, irritating, and tiresome. Jane Bennet, the eldest of 5 Bennet daughters. Pros: super beautiful, super kind. Would probably drop dead before saying a bad word about anyone. Cons: probably very boring to have a drink with. Elizabeth Bennet, the heroine. The stuff rom-com heroines are made of, obviously considering she's the OG. Spunky, sassy, strong-minded. The kind of woman all women think they are. Mary Bennet, a priggish, pretentious pseudo-intellectual. Kitty Bennet, a watered-down version of her younger sister Lydia. Lydia Bennet, the youngest Bennet, attention-seeking boy, crazy, airheaded, and kinda loose, to be honest. The novel opens with all these Bennets walking home from church. Mrs. Bennet is very excited because she's just heard that the neighborhood's biggest estate, Netherfield Park, has been rented out to a young man with no wife and a large fortune. "What's the big deal?" says Mr. Bennet. "Mr. Bennet!" shrieks Mrs. Bennet. "Don't you know what this means for our girls?" Mr. Bennet doesn't, so Mrs. Bennet proceeds to shriek some more. What it means is that since this rich man, Bingley, has no wife, he'll be wanting one, and the Bennets have 5 potential wives for him to choose from in the shape of their 5 daughters. Mr. Bennet doesn't care. Elizabeth and Jane are too sensible and ladylike to care. Lydia and Kitty only care about whether he's going to have a lot of parties, and Mary cares about, well, nobody cares what Mary cares about. The next big event is a local ball in the neighboring town of Meryton. The Bennets are all there, except Mr. Bennet, who's at home in his library. The Bingley party enter. They comprise Mr. Bingley, super nice, super cheerful guy. He likes everyone, he likes everything, and he's actually the male version of Jane, except less quiet and reserved. Miss Caroline Bingley, Mr. Bingley's unmarried sister, snooty and bitchy, very into his friend Mr. Darcy, who we shall get to in a couple of seconds. Mrs. Hurst, Mr. Bingley's married sister, also snooty and bitchy, is not, as far as we know, into Mr. Darcy, but sucks up to him anyway. Mr. Hurst, Bingley's brother-in-law, mainly just plays cards and grunts. Now we come to Mr. Darcy. Oh, Mr. Darcy, he's the OG hero. He's the guy who gave birth to the phrase tall, dark, and handsome. The arrogant fountainhead from which all Mills and Boon's heroes have sprung from. The man who has pretty much ruined all men for most women, including yours truly. Anyway, the ball proceeds, and so must I. Mrs. Bennet is thrilled to learn that Mr. Darcy is twice as rich as Mr. Bingley. She stops being thrilled after her daughter, Elizabeth, overhears Darcy telling Bingley that she, Elizabeth, is not pretty enough to dance with. Mrs. Bennet spends the rest of the novel being extremely rude to Darcy, But to be fair, you can't totally blame her for this. In fact, no one's thrilled by Darcy because he makes it clear that he finds them all extremely boring and too lame to talk to. Bingley's the opposite. He's like an excited spaniel, thrilled to meet everyone, happy with everything, and ready to dance with all the girls. He dances twice with Jane. In Regency England, this means that he really fancies her. So naturally, Mrs. Bennet is on cloud nine and goes home and tells her husband all about it until he begs her to stop. Over the next few weeks, the Bingleys and the Bennets continue to meet, mostly at other people's houses. Bingley has definitely fallen for Jane. She really likes him too, but doesn't act obvious about it. Bingley's sisters pretend they like Jane, but they don't really like anyone or anything. Darcy, who hadn't liked anyone or anything, is starting to kind of like Elizabeth. He starts gazing brutally at her all the time and occasionally listens in on her conversations. Now, this seems like creepy stalkerish behavior, but it isn't when you read the book, because Darcy's just way too hot and way too snooty to be a creepy stalker. Caroline Bingley, the unmarried sister, sidles up to him at a party. "I know what you're thinking," she says flirtatiously. "I doubt it," replies Darcy, unflirtatiously. "You're thinking, how boring, how dull, how vulgar all these people are." "No," he says. "I was thinking that Elizabeth Bennet's got beautiful eyes." "Oh," says Caroline Bingley. "That stupid provincial bitch," thinks Caroline Bingley. Soon after, a military regiment arrives in Meryton, stationed there for the winter. Lydia and Kitty, who are, if you recall, mad, go absolutely berserk. One night, while they're boring everyone, except Mrs. Bennet, who has a soft spot for hot men in red coats, by yapping about the soldiers, a note arrives for Jane from Caroline Bingley. "Hello, dear friend," says the note. "My brother and all the men are going off to hunt and shoot and do whatever rich men do in the 18th century. So me and my sister are all alone in this big empty mansion and already bored of each other. So do drop by for tea." At this point, we learn just how far Mrs. Bennet will go to get Jane and Bingley together. "You can't go by coach," she says to Jane, "because it looks like it's going to rain. Go on horseback." Isn't that exactly why she should go in a coach? Because it looks like it's going to rain, says everyone. "Oh my God, you fools!" shrieks Mrs. Bennet. "Don't you get it?" No, says everyone. "It's because it's going to rain that she needs to go on a horse. She's going to get stuck there and probably have to stay the night, giving Bingley more time to fall in love with her. Now off you go, Jane, and don't you dare take an umbrella." This crazy plan succeeds, maybe a little too well, because Jane gets soaked, catches a bad cold or flu or something similar, and is forced to remain at Netherfield, helpless and probably not at her most attractive. Elizabeth, who adores her sister, goes to visit her. Instead of taking the carriage, she goes on foot, as sassy, strong-minded, free-willed women tend to do. When she reaches Netherfield, the first person she bumps into is Darcy, who becomes extremely agitated, that is, turned on, by her wild and muddy appearance. Jane really is quite ill, and Elizabeth is invited to stay at Netherfield as well. While there, she engages in spirited debates with Mr. Darcy, unsettling and arousing him at the same time. The Bingley sisters spend their time making fun of the Bennets when Elizabeth isn't around. Unfortunately, Mrs. Bennet gives them more fuel when she drops in with Lydia and Kitty to visit Jane. She behaves rudely to Darcy, fawningly with Bingley, and inanely in general. Even carefree Elizabeth wishes the earth would open up and swallow her. Lydia, who has no manners, asks Bingley when he will have a ball at Netherfield. Bingley, who does have manners, replies that it shall be whenever she wants. The morning after Jane is back at Longbourn, Mr. Bennet announces that Mr. Collins, his cousin and heir, is going to stay with them for a few weeks. None of them have ever met Mr. Collins before, and they soon realize they haven't missed out. Mr. Collins is a pompous ass of a clergyman, obsessed with his patron, a Lady Catherine de Bourgh. Mr. Bennet, who's always up for a laugh, encourages him to speak about her. The floodgates open and will never shut again. Her ladyship is aristocracy with a capital A, Mr. Collins tells them. She's rich with a capital R. But amazingly, she's condescending with a capital C and has no trouble at all talking to people who are not rich aristocrats. She has stooped low enough, he says, with shining eyes. Low enough to tell me I ought to get married. Find her, Mr. Collins. Find her and marry her, and when you do, I shall visit her. My word, says Mr. Bennet. Oh, Mr. Bennet, that isn't all. She's the one, the clever, condescending lady. She's the one who suggested I should put shelves in my upstairs closet. Mr. Collins, she said, I suggest you put shelves in the upstairs closet. Shelves. Whoa, says Mr. Bennet, and goes back to his library. It's soon made pretty clear that Mr. Collins has come to Longbourn hoping to find a wife in one of the Bennet sisters. There was a fucked up law that existed back then where an entailed estate, like Mr. Bennet's, couldn't be passed on to a woman. Only Mr. Collins, as his closest male relative, could inherit. Mrs. Bennet realizes Collins's intention because he's not exactly subtle, and is thrilled because it'll mean he won't be able to kick all of them out after Mr. Bennet dies. Your daughter Jane is the hottest, says Mr. Collins to Mrs. Bennet. I think I might try my luck with her. Oh, how kind, replies Mrs. Bennet, but no way, Jose. She's practically engaged to someone much richer than you. Says Mr. Collins. How about the second one, then? Elizabeth, she's almost as beautiful. Go for it, says Mrs. Bennet. Mr. Collins goes for it, but Elizabeth is having none of it. She finds him pretty hard to shake off, though. The next thing that happens is a walk to Meryton. The Bennet sisters and Collins are going to visit Mrs. Phillips, Mrs. Bennet's sister. On the way, they bump into one of the hot soldiers they know. With him is an even hotter soldier, a guy called Wickham. Wickham, aside from being extremely dishy, is charming, amusing, and amiable. While they are all saying hello to each other, Darcy and Bingley ride by on their horses. Elizabeth notices that Darcy treats Wickham even worse than he treats everyone else. Wickham soon tells her why. It's a tragic story, he says softly, looking deep into Elizabeth's eyes. Darcy and I grew up together as boys. My father was Darcy Sr.'s estate manager, and Darcy Sr. liked me way more than he liked his own son. He wanted to leave me a lot of money, but after he died, Darcy Jr., that jealous prick, wouldn't give me any of it. Oh no, cries Elizabeth, how you must have suffered. Yes, says Wickham bravely, I did suffer. I still suffer. But please, dearest Miss Bennet, do not breathe a word of this to anyone. I will protect Darcy Jr.'s reputation out of respect for his father. More power to you, says Elizabeth Bennet, and keeps her promise. But everyone soon finds out anyway, mostly because Wickham's respect for Darcy Sr. cannot outweigh his desire to share his tragic tale. Elizabeth is too taken with him, however, to realize this. Next up is the Netherfield ball Bingley promised to hold. A lot of things go wrong. Wickham isn't there because he wants to avoid Darcy, so Elizabeth is crushed. She also realizes Mr. Collins wants to marry her and, understandably, feels icky about it. Darcy dances with her, and her opinion of him sinks even lower. She manages pissing him off, but since he's half in love with her by now, he doesn't stay pissed off for very long, and probably just wants her even more than he did before. Her family spend all evening humiliating themselves. Mrs. Bennet won't stop talking about how Jane and Bingley are a sure thing. Liddy and Kitty flirt outrageously with all the men, and Mr. Collins, learning that Darcy is Lady Catherine's nephew, insists on introducing himself to him. Elizabeth can't hear their conversation, but it seems obvious that Darcy is repulsed by Collins. All in all, it's a bad night for the Bennets, although only Elizabeth seems to realize this. The next day, Mr. Collins proposes marriage to Elizabeth through a long speech that assumes she will be overjoyed. She is not overjoyed and refuses him politely. "I know female ways," says Mr. Collins pompously. "Your no's mean yes, and your yeses mean no's, and your mouth is saying no, but your eyes are saying yes, and I'll try again in a bit. I don't mind at all. In fact, I'm even more attracted to you than before, because this is clearly a sign of female modesty." Elizabeth insists she is not being modest. Mr. Collins insists that she is. Mrs. Bennet, after hearing about what happens, insists that Elizabeth must marry Mr. Collins. Elizabeth insists she won't. Mrs. Bennet asks Mr. Bennet to step in and insist that she must. Mr. Bennet insists that if Elizabeth is dumb enough to marry such a goon, he will never see her again. Mrs. Bennet then insists on going into hysterics, and Mr. Collins, realizing that Elizabeth is serious about her refusal, insists that he was only doing them all a favor after all. A few days after, the Bennet girls' marriage prospects take a turn for the worse, because Jane gets a letter from Caroline Bingley saying all the Bingleys and Darcy are off to London and implies that they probably won't be back anytime soon. She also hints that Bingley wants to marry Darcy's sister. Jane is crushed because she loves Bingley, and Mrs. Bennet is crushed because she loves Bingley's money. Just when you think things can't get worse for the Bennets, at least for Mrs. Bennet, news arrives that Collins has proposed to Elizabeth's friend Charlotte, and, to Elizabeth's shock and horror, Charlotte has accepted him. "What's wrong with you?" Elizabeth says to Charlotte "What's wrong with you?" Elizabeth says to Charlotte as soon as she gets her alone. "Listen, Liz," says Charlotte. "Like you, I'm not rich. Unlike you, I'm not hot. This is probably the only time anyone's going to ask me to marry them. If I say no, I'm going to grow old alone and depend on my brothers for money, and if their future wives end up hating me, the rest of my life is going to be a total shitstorm. So, between that and the dunderhead, I'll take the dunderhead, thank you very much." "Ugh," says Elizabeth. Mrs. Bennet's brother, Mr. Gardiner, and his wife, Mrs. Gardiner, come to visit the Bennets. The Gardiners are good eggs, well-mannered, genteel, good-humoured, and understanding. They see how depressed Jane is and invite her to come back to London with them. Jane immediately cheers up and is excited, in a gentle ladylike way, of course, that she might get to see Bingley there. Mrs. Gardiner, whom Elizabeth is close to, warns her about Wickham. "He's too poor, you're too poor," she says. "It's just not going to work." "I know, no worries, Auntie. It's all good," says Elizabeth. She turns out to be right, because soon after, Wickham becomes interested in another girl, who is also conveniently an heiress. Elizabeth isn't too upset by this. She had a thing for Wickham, but she wasn't in love with him. Interestingly, she doesn't judge him for being a gold digger, although she didn't extend the same courtesy to Charlotte. In March, Elizabeth travels with Sir William Lucas, Charlotte's father, and Maria Lucas, Charlotte's sister, to visit Charlotte and Mr. Collins. Both the Collinses are delighted to see them. Mr. Collins takes them round the house, urging them to admire the furniture in the rooms, the size of the rooms, the views from the rooms, etc., talking so incessantly his guests don't have the opportunity to utter the praises he asks for. When a gracious invitation to dine at Rosings is extended to them by Lady Catherine, Mr. Collins's triumph is complete. "Now all of you know how much she favors me," he says, not completely directly, but directly enough. He spends the rest of the day telling them not to freak out by the magnificence of Rosings. When a gracious invitation to dine at Rosings is extended to them by Lady Catherine, Mr. Collins's triumph is complete. "Now all of you know how much she favors me," he says, not completely directly, but directly enough. He spends the rest of the day telling them not to freak out about the magnificence of Rosings and the wealth and rank of its mistress, all the while clearly expecting them to freak out. Elizabeth, unlike the rest, has no qualms about magnificence, wealth, or rank, and her heart alone beats normally as they enter the splendid house. Lady Catherine is basically the original Karen, bossy, spoiled, and all-round middle-aged upper-class douchebag. She loves receiving praise as much as Mr. Collins enjoys giving it. There are more compliments than conversation at dinner, and after dinner they have nothing to do except listen to Lady Catherine talk. Eventually, she realizes that other people exist and begins to ask a bunch of impertinent questions to Elizabeth and Maria, but mostly to Elizabeth because she's more unknown territory. How many sisters do you have? Oh, so many sisters. Do you play the piano? Do you sing? Do any of your sisters play the piano? Do they sing? Who is your governess? What? You didn't have a governess? Are any of your sisters out? What? All five? Out at once? That's very odd. That's really very odd. Shouldn't the older ones be married before the younger sister hit up parties? That's hardly likely to promote sisterly affection and unity, says Elizabeth, promptly becoming the first person ever to disagree with Lady Catherine to her face. She spends her time walking in the fields, drinking tea at Rosings, and hanging with Charlotte, and clearly something needs to happen soon, which it does. Mr. Darcy, who, if you recall, is Lady Catherine's nephew, is coming to Rosings. Even Elizabeth, who still despises him, is not annoyed by his arrival. Lady Catherine clearly thinks Darcy is the bee's knees and yaps on and on about how wonderful he is, heavily implying he will one day marry her daughter. Incest, by the way, was A-OK back in the day because keeping property in the family was more important than avoiding hair-lipped children. Mr. Darcy comes to call on the Collinses almost as soon as he arrives, and it is clever Charlotte who realizes that Elizabeth must be the draw. He arrives with his cousin, Colonel Fitzwilliam, who turns out to be charming, friendly, and a pleasant, sensible talker. Mr. Darcy, after muttering a sentence or two, sits down and doesn't speak to anyone and stares broodily at Elizabeth. No surprises there. Elizabeth asks him whether he met Jane when she was in London. She wants to see if his response will give her an inkling of what Bingley's deal is regarding Jane. Unfortunately, Mr. Darcy is a cold fish. He says he has not met Jane. Elizabeth can't think of anything else to say to him. He doesn't want to seem to say anything else at all, and he and his cousin, the Colonel, soon go away. Yet another invitation to Rosings follows, and Colonel Fitzwilliam pays special attention to Elizabeth during dinner. After the meal, she plays the piano. "You will never be good," screeches Lady Catherine from the next room, "unless you practice more. You can come practice on the piano in the housekeeper's room as befits your lowly status." And Darcy comes up to gaze at her silently. Actually, ignore that, Vic. Yet another invitation to Rosings follows, and Colonel Fitzwilliam pays special attention to Elizabeth during dinner. After the meal, she plays the piano, and Darcy comes up to her to gaze at her silently. Elizabeth decides to poke fun at him, telling the Colonel of his bad behavior. He didn't ask anyone to dance with him at all, at the Meryton ball. Mr. Darcy pays a couple of short visits to the Collins house, clearly to see Elizabeth, but no one seems to realize this except Charlotte. Not much conversation happens during these visits, and the little that does is pretty awkward. How's your family doing? How does Mrs. Collins like living here? Great, but she's really far from home. Really? I don't think it's very far. Oh, yes, it is very far. Oh, yes. Oh. Elizabeth soon has an even more awkward conversation with Colonel Fitzwilliam. It's about Bingley. Oh, yes, Bingley. Nice chap, says the Colonel. Darcy really looks after him. In fact, Bingley owes Darcy big time. What? Says Elizabeth. Why? Well, he got himself tangled up with some girl this summer and was on the verge of marrying her. But Darcy stepped in, luckily, and stopped it from happening. Because it would have been the worst decision Bingley ever made. Absolutely. Worst decision. He's so lucky to have a friend like Darcy. Really, so lucky. Elizabeth realizes the Colonel is talking about Jane, and as she thinks of the heartbreak her sister has suffered, her dislike of Darcy grows into intense dislike. This is unfortunate, because the next time they meet, Darcy asks her to marry him. I can't hold it in anymore, he tells her. I don't care how inferior your social position is. I don't care how vulgar your mother is. I'm so desperately in love with you. I'm willing to sink low enough to take you on as a wife. Fuck off, says Elizabeth. Well, damn, says Darcy. Why are you being so rude? Oh, you mean apart from the fact that you've just abused my family and made it clear that in marrying me you'll be lifting me out of the gutter? Well, thanks, but no thanks. Oh, yeah, and you also ruined the happiness of my favorite sister. Wait, what? Don't pretend, said Elizabeth. I know all about it. She loved Bingley, but she just wasn't good enough for him, was she? You're the reason she's been crying non-stop since summer. Oh, yeah, and I know how you treated Wickham as well. Oh, Wickham. Yeah, he's really suffered, hasn't he? His sufferings are indeed the stuff Russian novels are made from. Anyway, now I know what you think of me. Thanks very much. I'm off. Don't let the door hit you on the way out. After this emotional conversation, Darcy goes back to his aunt's house to write a letter. He finds a still overwhelmed Elizabeth trying to walk off all the fields and hands it to her. Don't worry, he says snootily before walking off. It doesn't contain a renewal of the proposal that was so disgusting to you. Elizabeth rolls her eyes and opens the letter. This is what it says. Imagine this being read in Darcy's voice. First of all, I didn't realize your sister was genuinely in love with Bingley. She's really reserved and hard to read. I thought your mother was pushing her at Bingley because he was rich. Let's face it, she wasn't exactly discreet about it, was she? And all I was doing was trying to save my friend from being married for his money. It's what any friend would do. I'm sorry, okay? I'm really sorry, except I'm not sorry. I don't see what else I could have done. Now, about Wickham. He's a big, fat liar. Yes, he was the son of my father's estate manager. Yes, we played together as boys. And yes, my father loved him. But Wickham became a big degenerate, and though he hid it from my father, he couldn't hide it from me. No way. After my father died, he told me that he didn't want to join the church on our estate as previously planned, and instead asked for a lot of money to do his own thing. I gave him a lot of money, he blew through it, came back, and said he'd join the church after all. Not happening, I said, and can you blame me? After I refused him the church job, Wickham tried seducing my sister. He'd convinced her to elope with him, but he didn't realize how close we are. She told me everything, and I managed to rescue her just in time. Wickham disappeared as soon as he found out I knew. Slimy snake. By the way, he didn't want my sister for herself. He wanted her for her money. She's really, really rich, just like me. And another thing, she was only 15 years old when this happened. If you don't believe me, you can ask the Colonel about it. He's one of her guardians and knows the whole story. Anyway, that's about it. God bless you. Now, this is roughly what the letter says, and Elizabeth, as you can imagine, feels many emotions while reading it. She's so pissed off about Jane, and snorts contemptuously while reading Darcy's explanation of it. But she's horrified when she reads about what Wickham did to poor teenage Miss Darcy. She believes Darcy, of course, especially because he cites the Colonel as someone who can confirm his version of events. She now begins to realize how stupid she was for believing everything Wickham said. Darcy and the Colonel leave Rosings, and Elizabeth doesn't get to meet them before they do, for which she is very relieved. She has no clue what she'd say to Mr. Darcy if she saw him, and the Colonel was showing signs of wanting to propose to her. Another proposal, she sensibly realizes, is the last thing she needs right now. All in all, Elizabeth has had a very unsettling holiday and is happy to go back home. Not that things are great not that things are great back there either. Jane is still heartbroken, and Elizabeth is worried that telling her what Darcy did will just make things worse. She does tell her about Wickham. Lydia and Kitty are in the depths of despair because it's time for the hot soldiers to leave. Elizabeth is thankful to see them go, especially Wickham. But then something happens. Mrs. Foster, who is a silly young thing married to the colonel of the regiment, invites Lydia, but not Kitty, to come to Brighton for the summer. Lydia is overjoyed. Kitty is broken-hearted, and Elizabeth has a serious conversation with her father about Lydia's behavior. She's out of control, Papa. Her behavior is disgusting. Don't let her go to Brighton. Are you mad? Says Mr. Bennet. Can you imagine the screams and the screeches if I don't let her go? Let her go. We'll have some peace around here finally. And anyway, Colonel Foster will look after her. In July, Elizabeth accompanies the Gardiners on a tour of the Derbyshire countryside, and their travels take them close to Darcy's manor, Pemberley. Hearing that Darcy is not in the neighbourhood, she agrees to take a tour of the estate. Pemberley turns out to be pretty spectacular, and Elizabeth realizes that to have been its mistress would have been very special. Everything about Pemberley pleases her, and her heart begins to soften towards its owner. Her feelings undergo even more change when the housekeeper giving them the tour talks about what a wonderful chap Darcy is. I've known him since he was a baby, she says. He was the sweetest, most generous-hearted boy in the world, and he hasn't changed a little bit. I know some people say he's proud just because he doesn't yap on like other men his age. But I've known him since he was a baby, and I've never heard him speak a cross word in his entire life. He was sweet and kind-hearted then, and he's sweet and kind-hearted now. Elizabeth has the sense to realize that this kind of tribute from a servant is really something special, and her feelings grow even more confused. These confused feelings are not helped by her running into Mr. Darcy while at Pemberley. I thought you were out of town, she gasps. I promise you we would have never come here to see the estate otherwise. I'm so sorry, Don't worry about it, says Darcy calmly. Why don't you introduce me to your friends? Ha, thinks Elizabeth. Once he realizes my uncle is a merchant in London, he'll suddenly remember he has to be somewhere else. But she's wrong. Darcy is perfectly charming to them, even inviting Mr. Gardiner to come and fish for trout in the Pemberley stream whenever he wants. When it's time for them to leave, he escorts them back to the carriage and tells Elizabeth that Mr. Bingley is coming to Pemberley the next day. So is his sister, Miss Darcy. I have told her about you, he says, and she's been dying to meet you. May I introduce you to her once she's here? Sure, says Elizabeth shyly. If your heart If your heart is beating fast on hearing this, I know mine is, imagine the state of Elizabeth's. On the way back to the inn they're staying at, she's dying to ask her aunt and uncle what they think of Darcy. Her aunt and uncle, who have realized that Darcy is into Elizabeth, are dying to talk about him as well. But in true British Regency fashion, they don't talk about what they want to, and instead talk about what they don't have to. Darcy brings Bingley and Miss Darcy to meet Elizabeth and the Gardiners the very next morning. The Gardiners realize that Darcy is deeply in love with their niece, but being the kind of folk who mind their own business, keep calm, and behave normally. Bingley is delighted to see Elizabeth again and asks her pointed questions about the whereabouts of all her sisters. Miss Darcy, who's very sweet, very shy, and very in awe of her brother, invites them all to dine at Pemberley. The following morning, Elizabeth and Mrs. Gardiner visit Pemberley to call on Miss Darcy. Both Bingley sisters are present, and neither of them are pleased to see Elizabeth. "I hear those low-class soldiers have left Meryton," says Miss Bingley spitefully to Elizabeth. "That must be a huge loss for your family." Elizabeth, as befits a good heroine, refrains from being bitchy, and realizing the indirect reference to Wickham might embarrass poor Miss Darcy, calmly changes the subject, much to Darcy's relief and approval. After the guests depart, Miss Bingley, who for all her sophistication doesn't seem to know basic human psychology, criticizes Elizabeth loudly. "I never would have recognized her. She's so skinny, and she's so brown, and she's so coarse. I never thought she was pretty. Certainly not as pretty as people said. But really, she's actually almost ugly." "Well," says Darcy, "I think she's one of the most beautiful women I've ever met." He then goes away, and Miss Bingley is left to the satisfaction of having forced him to say something that hurts no one except herself. When Elizabeth and the Gardiners return to the inn, they find terrible news from Jane waiting for them. None of them realize it's terrible, so the Gardiners go off on a walk, fondly imagining they're leaving their niece to a nice cozy hour of reading. The letter is about Lydia, who's run away with Wickham. No one knows where they've gone, but everyone knows they probably haven't gotten married. So Lydia has finally accomplished what she's been threatening to do throughout the novel: bring disgrace and ruin to herself and her sisters. Elizabeth, realizing this, rushes out to find her aunt and uncle and bumps into Mr. Darcy. She then completely breaks down and tells him what happened and says that she and her aunt and uncle must return home immediately. "Yes," says Darcy, "you must. I'll go tell my sister that you can't make it for dinner, but I won't tell anyone why." "They'll soon know," thinks Elizabeth grimly. On the way home, though, Mr. Gardiner attempts to comfort her by saying Wickham will definitely marry Lydia because he won't want his own career and reputation ruined. "Yeah, right," says Elizabeth. When they get home, they learn that Mr. Bennet has gone to London in search of Lydia and Wickham. Mrs. Bennet has taken to her room. She's also taken leave of whatever little sense she possessed and spends all her time having hysterics. "What was Colonel Foster thinking? It's his fault. He should have taken care of my baby, my poor little girl. So innocent, so trusting. That Wickham. It's all his fault. He deceived her. He lured her away with false promises. I know it. I know it. I know it. And now Mr. Bennet is in London, and he'll challenge Mr. Wickham to a duel. And Wickham will kill him, and those Collinses will get this house and turn us all out, and we'll be homeless by tomorrow. Oh, my poor nerves. Oh, what did I do to deserve this? Oh." Mr. Gardiner follows Mr. Bennet to London, but they can't find Wickham or Lydia. Mr. Bennet arrives home. "Why? Why is he coming back?" screeches Mrs. Bennet, forgetting about her fears of him being killed in a duel with Wickham. "Why is he coming back without my baby?" and locks himself in the study. He tells Elizabeth that he should have listened to her warnings about Lydia's behavior and praises her astuteness. The Bennets receive a visit from Mr. Collins. Mrs. Bennet is still having hysterics in her room, so the Bennet daughters are forced to accept his condolences instead. "If your sister had died," he tells them solemnly, "it would have been less trouble than this. Her reputation is destroyed forever. So is yours. I must say, I'm quite glad I didn't marry into your family now. Gosh, how terrible. Gosh, What a disgrace! Oh, yeah, and I've told Lady Catherine everything, and she says that no one's ever going to marry any of you. No, you're all poison. Charlotte and I are so sorry for you all. So sorry for you. 2 days after Mr. Bennet returns, Mr. Gardiner sends a letter saying that Wickham and Lydia have been found, and Wickham will marry her if the Bennets will guarantee him a small income. Mr. Bennet decides that marriage to a scoundrel is better than a ruined reputation, and Lydia is a proven idiot anyway, so he agrees. But he tells Elizabeth and Jane that their uncle must have forked out a huge sum of money to get Wickham to agree to the marriage. He owes him a big debt. Mrs. Bennet has hysterics again when she hears the news, this time from Happiness. "Oh, my sweet girl, the first of all her friends to be married! A wife before she turned 17! And that Wickham, he's so handsome! What a fine and charming fellow he is! Mr. Bennet! Mr. Bennet! You must give me money so I can buy Lydia some new clothes." "What? What do you mean you won't?" "How could you be so mean, Mr. Bennet? You're a disgrace." Wickham is offered a commission in the north of England. "My poor baby, going so far away," wails Mrs. Bennet. And Mr. Gardiner asks Mr. Bennet if the newlyweds can stay with them for a few days before they carry on to the north. "Absolutely not," says Mr. Bennet, but changes his mind because he can't cope with his wife's tantrums. The Wickhams arrive and show a shameless lack of concern for the trouble they've caused, which disgusts everyone except Mrs. Bennet. During the visit, Lydia talks about the wedding. "My aunt and uncle were so mean. They wouldn't let me go to any parties. Aunt just sat there and lectured me about a bunch of boring shit. And then on my wedding day, when we got to the church, Mr. Darcy—" "Mr. Darcy?" interrupts Elizabeth, amazed. "Oh, yes, he was there. But, oh my gosh, giggle, giggle, giggle. Don't tell anyone. It was supposed to be a secret." Elizabeth doesn't say anything, but she sends a letter to her aunt asking her for an explanation. Wickham finds time to slink up to Elizabeth, casually mentioning that he saw Darcy in London. "Did I tell you about the suffering he caused me when—" "Yes, you did," said Elizabeth, "and I've heard that you didn't suffer as much as you seem to think you did." Wickham goggles at her and then slinks away. After the Wickhams leave, Lydia urging her sisters to come visit with promises that she'll find husbands for them, a letter arrives for Elizabeth from Mrs. Gardiner, saying that Darcy was the one who found Wickham and paid him to marry Lydia. She thought Elizabeth knew about it, and hopes her niece is not upset enough to ban her from Pemberley, a hint that Elizabeth doesn't know whether to be pleased or upset by. She tells no one, not even Jane, about the letter. Longbourn is thrown into further turmoil when news arrives that Bingley is returning to Netherfield Park. He soon visits the Bennets' home, accompanied by Darcy. Mrs. Bennet receives Bingley with a familiarity that embarrasses her daughters, and Darcy with a cold formality that pains them. Darcy's gone back to his usual taciturn self. Elizabeth is bewildered by his manner and comes to the miserable realization that Darcy can't behave in front of her mother the way he can in front of her aunt and uncle. Bingley comes a couple of more times to visit. Darcy does not come with him. Mrs. Bennet tries none too subtly to get him and Jane alone together. At some point, they get engaged. Everyone is overjoyed, none more so than Mrs. Bennet. A week after the engagement, the Bennets get an unexpected visitor, Lady Catherine de Bourgh. She spends a few minutes being rude to Mrs. Bennet and then asks Elizabeth to walk outside with her. Elizabeth follows her puzzled. "I have heard a ridiculous rumour," says Lady Catherine as soon as they're alone. "A ridiculous rumour. People are saying, they're actually saying, that my nephew, Mr. Darcy, is thinking of degrading himself enough to marry you. It isn't true. I know it's not. My nephew isn't so stupid, but when I heard this news, I decided I should come and speak to you about it." Elizabeth sensibly points out that coming all the way to Longbourn was a silly thing to do for a rumour Lady Catherine knew to be untrue. "Do you know who I am?" screams Lady Catherine. But since this is clearly a rhetorical question, she doesn't wait for an answer, and instead continues to abuse Elizabeth. She tells her that Mr. Darcy is engaged to her daughter. "What do you have to say about that?" she says triumphantly. "Well, all I have to say is that if it is true, I don't know why you're so worried about him being engaged to me," replies Elizabeth. It turns out the engagement isn't an engagement at all. It's more of an expectation, and the only person who expects it is Lady Catherine. She continues to rant and rave about Darcy's noble ancestors and Elizabeth's low-class relatives. "Are the shades of Pemberley to be polluted by someone like you?" she howls. Elizabeth, who's had a lot of practice with hysterical women thanks to her mother, remains unfazed by this tantrum, and Lady Catherine soon leaves, darkly prophesying that Elizabeth will be Darcy's downfall. Elizabeth doesn't tell anyone about the reason for Lady Catherine's visit, and it becomes yet another Darcy-related secret even Jane doesn't know about. But it's not a secret she'll have to keep for long. Darcy returns to the neighbourhood. They all set off on a walk together, Jane, Bingley, Kitty, Darcy, Elizabeth. But Darcy and Elizabeth soon manage losing the others. And now it's their first moment together alone, and Elizabeth thanks him for everything he did for Lydia, telling him that none of the other Bennets know the truth. "I didn't do it for them," Darcy says, avoiding eye contact with her. "I did it for you." And then comes one of the most romantic moments in literary history. "You're too generous to fuck with me," Darcy says to Elizabeth. "If you still feel the way you did last summer, tell me. I will never bring up this subject again. My feelings haven't changed." Elizabeth doesn't say much, but she doesn't need to. Darcy has his answer. Mr. Bennet, when he hears about Elizabeth's engagement, is taken aback because he thought she hated Darcy. "Isn't he an arrogant asshole? Are you marrying him for his money? Don't do that. Living with someone you have no respect for is the worst. Trust me, I know." Elizabeth tells her father that she isn't marrying for money, and Darcy isn't an asshole. In fact, he's the one who found Wickham and paid him to marry Lydia. Mr. Bennet is reassured by this. He tells Elizabeth that he's sure he will like Darcy as much as he likes Bingley, although Wickham will always be his favourite. Elizabeth is nervous about telling her mother, knowing of her hatred for Darcy. Here we realize that Elizabeth doesn't know her mother all that well. Hate Mr. Darcy? What? No way. Mrs. Bennet, realizing that her daughter is about to marry one of the richest men in the country, is transported to ecstasies more exhausting than any we've seen through this entire novel. "My clever Lizzie! He's so rich, so handsome. Oh, I hope he will forgive my rudeness to him. Total misunderstanding. Oh my God, you're going to have more carriages than Jane. You'll have more servants. Oh, I always liked him. Oh, you're going to be so rich. Oh, my dear Lizzie. Oh, oh, oh." To sum up, Pride and Prejudice is a deeply complex novel about first impressions, class distinctions, personalities and behaviors, social norms, morality and ethics, true love between deserving people, and, if you think about it, the triumph of a foolish woman's wildly improbable and incredibly materialistic dreams for her daughters.